With me being visually impaired, I don't read Braille, but we also had everything available in print. In the corner right here of the piece, you see the gun smoke being conveyed. And of course, you see the soldiers with their rifles. So it makes perfect sense for the gun smoke to be in the air.
Hello and welcome back to AmRev360. I'm Scott Stephenson, President and CEO of the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, and I'm so excited today to be speaking with Brian Anderson and Sam Foulkes from the Clovernook Center for the Blind and Visually Impaired about how the museum has partnered with the Clovernook Center to develop three-dimensional tactile graphics for an exhibition the museum has mounted of Don Troiani's paintings of the Revolutionary War.
Well, my name is Brian Anderson. I am visually impaired. I have been at Clovernook for about 10 and a half years, and my role is Arts and Accessibility Coordinator, where I work with different museums and public spaces to help make them more accessible for those who are blind or visually impaired. Things such as Braille, tactile graphics, audio, and large print.
Gotcha. And Sam, you are Director of Braille Production at Clovernook, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And essentially my role here in terms of our Arts Initiative is to utilize our resources for these different projects. So Brian and I will often work together to find a solution for a space, a museum, a performing arts center that we can supply a solution for with what we have here at Clovernook. So what we do is we actually get funding to support all of our work so that we can offer it to museums for free. So it's a risk-free way for a space to experiment with accessibility and see what works and see what doesn't. And so we launched this kind of on a smaller scale with a few Ohio museums, and it quickly snowballed into a series of relationships with museums across the country.
Now, can you tell me a little bit about the history of Clovernook? This is not a new organization by any means.
We have been around since 1903. So we were founded by a pair of sisters, one of whom was blind. And initially it was a home for blind women. We're located kind of on the outskirts of Cincinnati, Ohio. And in 1914, we were gifted a printing press. So Cincinnati in the early 20th century was actually one of the printing capitals of the world. And the sisters who founded Clovernook had all these relationships with all these different printers. So they were set up with printing presses, paper, and we began producing. Back then, it wasn't called Braille. It was a different form of tactile writing called New York Point. In the 1920s, we switched to Braille. So Braille is, think of it as a code and not a language. So it's a way of representing written text in a tactile format. It's a little bit more complicated than most folks might realize. So it's not just letter for letter, A is A, B is B, C is C. You have hundreds of abbreviations, kind of like shorthand, secretarial shorthand, for common words, common letter pairings. There are different codes for different systems of writing. So music has its own code. Math here in the US, somewhat problematically, has two different codes. Different languages all have their own Braille codes as well. And we have always been a nonprofit. And since our founding, and since we began producing Braille, we have a specific focus on employment. So we try to be as inclusive an employer as we can. So the majority of our staff, historically and currently, are blind or low vision. So we try to ensure that we are including the people who benefit from what we produce in every facet of production. And so we've been producing Braille here for over 100 years. We have primarily been producing it for the Library of Congress. So we produce a lot of the accessible media that they offer through a variety of programs.
Fantastic. Yeah, I wanted to share with those who are watching the episode just an example of this tactile graphic that you all produced for us. And so you'll recognize, of course, the painting, the original painting over my shoulder. And I wonder if you could just describe the graphic, the kind of process. Obviously, it doesn't have every single detail of the painting, so I'm just curious whether it's you, Sam, or Brian, sort of talking about how you approach and what the what the experience of using an item like this is.
When approaching this, we want to figure out what needs to be, what's the most important information to be conveyed in the image. And so with the Boston Massacre being the case, we sat down and I did a survey with a variety of blind and visually impaired individuals to get their opinion on what they thought was great, what needed to be improved. We love candid feedback. And for example, in this image where you may see this raised texture right here that is snow, and then the circular figures that was supposed to be conveyed as snowballs. Huh. And one of the greatest issues that individuals had was that they got really confused by it. And the great thing about surveying blind and visually impaired individuals is they know what things are supposed to feel like, even though they may not be able to see it well. So what we came up with as a result is, of course, we took out all of the texture that we were using to represent snow and just created snowflakes. And that made it much easier for the end user to be able to convey, okay, these people, it's snowing outside. The figures were very easy to figure out. They were able to feel the men and their rifles and the building in the background. But that was just, just a small example of what a survey can do for a public space.
Oh. Brian, I'd love for you, to talk about the Concord Bridge fight there, which there's a lot going on in that painting, of course. And so, as you're working on producing a tactile graphic there, can you talk a little bit about what's in that image?
With the tactile key here, it is able to allow the end user to get an idea of what is what. Like you said, there's a lot going on. And what people really appreciated was being able to tell who were the Minutemen and who were the opposing soldiers that were on opposite ends of the bridge. I know the biggest issue that individuals had was the water under the bridge, which is kind of represented tactilely in like a Y shape. And they said they had a difficult time resonating with it because when they felt it, it didn't give them an idea that was water. It didn't allow them to believe that. And so the brush that's kind of above that, what a lot of individuals suggested was switching the Y shape down here with the water with the brush that they said that gives them more a perspective of thinking of it as water, while the Y is more of a tree shape. That would allow them to believe that was brush. And so that was kind of the greatest feedback. So what we do from there is we sit down with our graphic designer to make the necessary changes based off of the feedback that I received in the survey.
And what Brian was also kind of hinted at there was the specific complexity of this image. So unlike the Troiani paintings where a lot of it's in the forefront, this has just a lot of very granular detail in the background. So this was a really interesting design experiment where it was more of a rendered in abstraction. So all those small, tiny soldiers kind of on either side of the bridge are rendered not as tiny soldiers, but as triangles and squares. And all these little elements that are kind of in the background of the painting are rendered in all these different textures. And so this key that Brian was displaying, those show those textures and those abstract shapes, and then in Braille say, you feel this shape, that is a Minuteman. You feel this shape, and it's water. And it's been a really interesting project, and I can see why Brian says it's his favorite, because it's a really interesting way, I think, to try to interpret something where there are a lot of details, and nearly all of the details are important to understanding the painting.
Sure. I imagine it was a similar challenge with the painting As Brave Men as Ever Fought, which was specially commissioned by the museum for this exhibition for part of our collection. And similarly, is a very sort of crowded scene, in this case in an urban environment here in Philadelphia, and showing African American and American Indian soldiers in the Continental Army marching right past the site of the museum here in Philadelphia, past Independence Hall. But I know as a sighted individual looking at that, of course, it's a very simplified image, but there's a lot of detail going on there as well.
Yeah, and that's why the conversations with museum staff are so important, and that's why when we start any project like this, Brian and I and our graphic designer have back and forth conversations with museum staff. So with these Troiani paintings last year, we would have specific conversations with museum staff around, we can kind of see what is visually standing out, but we are not historians. We don't know what is going to be the most important thing in that painting in terms of the context. Is it the soldiers, or is it actually, the hat, or is it the weaponry? So when you have an image that is that crowded, it's very much a conversation between the institution and the designers of the graphic to kind of determine what is contextually the thing or the things that are trying to be taught or learned by the user of that, or the person experiencing that piece.
Fantastic. Yeah, I will certainly encourage all of my fellow museum directors to be in touch, because this is certainly a powerful tool to make sure that we are as accessible as possible, and I hope that it really spreads and becomes the gold standard in museum exhibitions as we move forward.